Hello. We're talking today about Beowulf, and it continues in the vein we've been um, for a lot of this class with a heroic story about um, sort of quasi mythical people doing great deeds, and in particular, right? There are certainly affinities between Beowulf and Gilgamesh, and in other ways, affinities between Beowulf and people like Hector and Achilles. Although that's a little less obvious, um, but it does make for a sort of continuation of our sort of thinking about epic, right, across cultures and times and things like that. It's certainly not the only concern of the class, but it has been a persistent theme. And the interesting thing, of course, one interesting thing, of course, is that as similar as Beowulf might seem to Gilgamesh in some ways, right? It's important to remember that that we think of it all as really old stuff, right? But Beowulf is practically modern um, in relative terms. Um, the manuscript of Beowulf that we have is only 1,000 years old, and that might seem like a lot, but remember that Gilgamesh, the stone tablets we have of Gilgamesh, are um, uh, go back at least twice that, right? 2,500 years. Sorry, what am I talking about? More than three times, right? Three times that, because we're talking about 1500 BC at least. And so actually, Beowulf is closer in time to us than it is to Gilgamesh by far. It's one of my favorite works to discuss. It's one of my favorite works to sort of ruminate over, to teach. I have an abiding love for it in many ways, as frustrating as it can be sometimes. And I'm going to try to get through um, some key things I want to talk about without the lecture being too long. And just we'll can't possibly discuss everything, but I'll hope to get through what I can. Now, let's talk a little bit about the context of this work. Right, this is a work of British literature. It's usually considered to be the sort of foundation in some ways of British literature. Right, if you get an anthology of British literature, Beowulf will probably be the first thing, and there's a little misleading in some ways because it's certainly not the oldest work of British literature. It's just like one of the oldest that we have. And it's in some ways it's even unfair to call it, or sort of inaccurate to call it the foundation of British literature, because unlike something like the Iliad or the Odyssey, or even some things we'll look at later like Dante's Inferno, or even the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, right? Beowulf does not have a continuous tradition, like a continuous transmission. It was not read and handed down continuously from the time it was written until the present day. In fact, it was lost and forgotten for probably at least 500-600 years. I mean, I'm just spitballing there, right? From the time of the Norman conquest until at least the 1800s. Well, so that's more like 700 years. Um, the 18th century, I should say, not the 1800s. Nobody really knew anything about Beowulf. Chaucer didn't know Beowulf, and presumably Shakespeare didn't know Beowulf. Milton didn't know Beowulf. So it was forgotten for a while. So it doesn't have the kind of enduring influence that other great works of literature have, like the Iliad. Right, the Iliad was read continuously, pretty much from the time of classical Athens until today. And it's always been read. It's never been forgotten. It's always been an influential work. Beowulf was, had a period where it was basically unknown, and then it was rediscovered. And part of the reason for that, of course, are the historical circumstances. This image here, this is an image of the Bayeux Tapestry, and what it depicts here is a great battle that you might have heard of, might not, a great battle from 1066. The year 1066 AD, that is 1066, about 1,000 years ago, a little less than 1,000 years ago. Well, it's 2022, so yeah, a little less than 1,000 years ago. And it is a battle between, this is William the Conqueror, I think. No, this is somebody. It's a Norman prince. The Normans in a great battle against the Anglo-Saxons, which is the culture that produced Beowulf. And the Normans were French speakers, right? William the Conqueror was a French Duke of Normandy who conquered Britain in the year 1066 as a result of victory at this Battle of Hastings, and that completely changed the course of British history. Because Britain was conquered by French-speaking Normans in 1066, a lot of the older British culture, the Anglo-Saxon culture, was suppressed and sort of at best fell out of fashion. At worst, was outright suppressed. Right, the language of the court became French. The language of literacy became French and Latin, as opposed to English and Latin, although I say English with a wink because it was very different than our kind of English, right? It was Old English, but it was still English. And so you had a new literary culture, a new culture in every respect, right? The kind of continental European medieval culture came and took hold in England, and it produced the line of kings that we're familiar with today, that we're familiar with, but that kind of endures into this day. William the Conqueror King William the First. I used to know them all. William the Conqueror, King Stephen, Henry the First. No, William the Conqueror, William the Second, Henry the First, King Stephen, Henry the Second, Richard the First, King John, Richard the Second, and on and on and on. And, till we get into the kings that are sort of that are the stars of Shakespeare's history plays, and eventually you get to, Queen Elizabeth II, somehow, who's still queen today. But these kings, these Norman kings, didn't speak English; they spoke French. And French became the de facto language of the elite in England, and that kind of filtered down through the entire culture, and it had profound effects not only on the culture but also on language. The language that we speak today, the English that we speak today, is in fact a kind of hybrid of English in its pure form, which is a Germanic language, and French, which is a Romance language, right, descended from Latin. And they're both Indo-European. They belong to the same larger family group, but they separate families within that group. And let me show you. Well, let's see. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the language of the poem. I like to do that. Talk a little bit about the original language. Of course, we read almost everything in translation in this class, so I like to talk a little bit about what these things sounded like. As I said, the manuscript dates to around 1000. As we said with Gilgamesh, that does not give you the time of composition, because like Gilgamesh, Beowulf is comprised of stories and legends that would have been transmitted orally long before they were ever written down. And so we have here another example of a kind of an oral formulaic work that is transformed gradually or in different versions into a sort of formal written epic as we have it today. And so the origin of the text probably goes back to at least the 8th century AD. The events depicted seem to be set in the 6th century. Don't know for sure when it was written. You could pick up. I have this standard Beowulf text called the Beowulf Handbook, and there's a whole section on when the poem was written, and there's no real consensus or agreement. There are some people who think that the composition of the poem is very close to the manuscript itself, but most people feel like the poem probably goes back at least to the 8th or 9th century BC. BC. I gotta stop saying BC. I'm so used to saying BC from our ancient period. AD. We've actually jumped ahead pretty far in history because the Aeneid was what? The 1st century AD, during the reign of Emperor Augustus, and so Beowulf is at least 800 years later. Pretty big jump. We've sort of vaulted over the quote-unquote Dark Ages, which weren't really dark, but their darkness is reinforced by classes like this one who tend to skip them over. And so it doesn't depict the present day. It's not telling a story that its readers would have been like, oh yeah, this is happening today. This is about our time, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? It's a work, and Gilgamesh as well, right? It's a work depicting what even to the readers of the 9th century or the 10th century would have considered old, right? These are days of yore, and the poem begins that way. We have heard of the deeds of the Spear Danes in days of yore, in days gone by. Or, well, why don't we look at that opening, right? So I've got here a text, and this is the same as our text, but it's got it's got the Old English and Foss. Up here, let's go to page 1. So in our book, I'm going to use line numbers here because what I realize is if I ever want to reuse these lectures, the line numbers will be more universal than the page numbers. So in our Beowulf text, this is look at the very beginning of the poem. Line 1, it would be, I'll just tell you real quick, in the 2-volume Norton that we're using, the shorter Norton that we're using, volume 1, it's page 842. If this is some future semester, you have to find a page number yourself, but it's line 1. So the Spear Danes in days gone by. Oh, let's get here. Where are you? Okay. So the Spear Danes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. So as you can see, this opening sets the stage that we're going back to ancient times, or the days gone by. Yardaim. Let me show you the Old English. All right. So here's what it actually looks like in the language of the time, and we call it English, right? And maybe you've even used the term Old English colloquially to refer to things like Shakespeare, right, or whatever. Shakespeare wrote in modern English, not Old English. There are basically 3 broad categories of historical English that we can talk about. There's modern English, which is the language that we speak, and also the language that Shakespeare spoke and wrote in, right? There's Middle English, which is the language of Chaucer. And that's a little harder for us to understand, but still fairly possible, right? If you've read the Canterbury Tales in high school, maybe you've had some exposure to Chaucer or Middle English. On specially from every sheerest end of England to Canterbury we wend, the holy blissful martyr for to sake. I mean, you didn't get every word of that, but you can sort of hear it's English, right? And then we have Old English. Now this is English as it sounded before the Norman conquest in 1066, before the entire cultural and political situation in England was transformed by the Norman invasion. It's the language of the Germanic tribes that migrated to Britain. Sorry, you got to be careful about England versus Britain. Britain is the geographical island. England is a country, is a political thing. There was no England before the English got there. These were Germanic tribes that migrated to Britain or conquered Britain. There's a lot of myths and legends and quasi histories and actual history about how it is that these Germanic tribes ended up in Britain. The short version is that there were Britons in Britain already, right? The Celtic peoples, right? The descendants of, or the ancestors of the Irish and the Scotch and the Scots and the Welsh and the Cornish and people like that, right? Were in the British Isles already, and they had been a Roman province for a very long time, and there were Roman legions stationed there, and there were Roman defenses, things like Hadrian's Wall, right? And as the Roman Empire collapsed, eventually the legions left, the Roman military presence was gone, and it wasn't seen as like a liberation or anything like that. It was bad for the Britons that lived there because they no longer had any protection, and there were all sorts of wild mountain people like Picts and Scots who wanted to prey on them. So the story is that the Celtic the Britons, right, the ethnically Celtic people who spoke a Celtic languages, things like Welsh, right, invited, hired basically Germanic tribes people from the continent as mercenaries, and the three traditional tribes that are mentioned by the historian, the Venerable Bede, in his ecclesiastical history are the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. So these three tribes came over to Britain, liked what they found when they got there, and quickly went from mercenaries to conquerors. And by the time you get to the 7th century, it's a Germanic state, basically. Our word English, I'm going to Google Doc up here to show you. Our word English derives from the name of one of those tribes that I mentioned, the Angles, right? The Anglican, they were called, and they spoke a language called Anglish, which over time became English, right? You may also be familiar with the term Anglo-Saxon, right? Which is the term given to the culture of this pre-Norman, post-Roman Britain, right? When Britain was ruled by these Germanic peoples speaking their Germanic language. Sorry, I should have this up already. What's going on here? So yeah, these Germanic tribes, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, came to Britain around the 5th century. Over the course of it wasn't like a really quick conquest. It was over the course of 100 years, gradually sort of conquest and continued migration of these Germanic peoples basically turned Britain from it had been a Roman province, and then it was a sort of kind of independent Celtic loose confederation, and over the period of the 5th century became this Anglo-Saxon polity, this Germanic polity. It wasn't a single kingdom. Without getting too much into it, there were different Germanic kingdoms that took root on the island of Britain. Over this period, you had the West Saxons, the East Saxons, the East Anglians, the Northumbrians. There were multiple kingdoms with their own kings, and they don't really become unified, anything like unified, until much later, around 300 years later, during the reign of King Alfred the Great. But if in Latin, sort of the whole region kind of became known as, why isn't this working? Come on. There we go. The land of the Angles, right? Anglum Terram, right? In England, it would have been Angleland, right? Angleland, and sort of that became England, right? That's where the word England comes from this, the name of this Germanic tribe. All right, back to the text. So they had many dialects of their quote unquote English, right? This old English, this Germanic tongue, right? Here's what it sounds like. This is the opening. What? We gardena in Jardajum. Theud Kuninga Thrimja Frunan, Huda Athelingus Ellen Fremedon. And as you can hear, right, there's nothing really intelligible about that at all. I mean, it is a different language until you look at it a little more closely, then you sort of start to see it, right? What is our word what? What? But here it's being used kind of as a call to attention, like pay attention. We, that's still our word we, the Gardena, this is the word that means spear Danes, right? In Yardayun, in days gone by. Theod Kuninga from Yefrunan. Now, Kuninga is related to our word king, and if you look at the translation, the kings who ruled them, right? Theod Kuninga is a compound. It means like lordly king or something like that. And Huda Athelingus Ellen Fremeran. Huda, how those princes, Athelingus, uh, Fremeran means accomplished, and Ellen means deeds. So it's really hard, right? It's nothing that a modern English speaker can just pick up and start reading. And then that's a result of the fact that English changed so radically on account of the political and cultural changes that happened in the 11th century. You know, if a French college student can pick up the Song of Roland, which is a medieval French epic, even older than Beowulf, actually. I think, right? Like seven. It's because it deals with the Franks. I should be careful what I say, right? I get into trouble when I say things, right? But it's a medieval epic, a French epic, just like Beowulf. A French student can pick up the Song of Roland and read it. You know, it's hard, right? It's not easy for a modern French speaker to read the Song of Roland, but you can make something out of it because French has changed a lot less than English. We can't pick up something from pre-Norman times and just start reading it. It's too different. It's too hard. So this is Old English, there is a kind of art to the poetry, although it's not easy to see. You know what? To demonstrate this, I'm gonna let me pick out a passage from later in the text. Right. This is when Grendel is attacking Heorot, and and I can sort of show you how our translator Seamus Heaney tries to capture the artistry of the poetry. All right. So, okay, here's the lecture note, the lecture slide that deals with the language. Let me just skip ahead to this one for a second. Here's the manuscript of Beowulf, and you can see that what Wegadena, it's even harder in the Old English script. There's a kind of runic component here. I don't want to get too into it, but that's a runic W right there, the second letter, and there's another runic W in we. This is the word we, using a runic W instead of a more familiar Latin W that we would recognize. So anyway, it's not easy. So there no fixed length or meter. So do you remember, of course, in Greek and Latin poetry, we had meter that was determined by, if you watch the video, right, by the length of the line and the pattern of the syllables, dactylic hexameter. Arma virumque cano troiaequi primus abores. That's the first line of the Aeneid. I sing of arms and the man who first came from Troy, etc., etc. Italiam fatto profugus lavinaque venit. So every line has that same sort of rhythmic pattern. Dum da da 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 dum. Old English poetry is different. It doesn't have that kind of meter. Instead, it is based on patterns of alliteration and the use of a caesura. Now, let me explain both these terms. Alliteration is the repetition of initial consonant sounds. You might have known that already, right? So like Krispy Kreme donuts, right? Right, Krispy Kreme. That's alliteration, right? Or Dunkin' Donuts, same thing. I don't know why my mind's on donuts right now. I think I'm hungry. Repetition of initial consonant sounds in a kind of patterned way in the poetry. And caesura is a break or pause in the middle of a poetic line, right? So both these things are sort of the key to how Old English poetry works. Where were we? Yeah. Let me show you in the text. Okay, so line 710. Turn to line 710 for a second. This is Seamus Heaney talking about Grendel's approach to Heorot. This is the second time. This is not when he originally attacks. This is when Beowulf is there lying in wait for him. Excuse me. In off the moors, down through the mistbands, God-cursed Grendel came greedily loping. And now, so Heaney renders this line in English this way. And then you can see the alliteration in each line, right? In off the moors, down through the mistbands. Well, we've got moors and mist, right? And this next line, very heavy alliteration. God cursed Grendel came greedily loping. So God, Grendel, and greedily, right? There's the alliteration. In the original Old English, so pretty faithful translation by Heaney. Here's the original Old English. Tha kom of moor, under misleelten, Grendel gongen, goddess ihre bar. And the literal translation would be then he came from the moors under the mist covering, right? Grendel stalked goddess ihre bar, carrying the anger, the ire of God. Pretty close translation, but note what's he really captures is the alliteration. We have the same moor and mistleotham. In Heaney, it was moors and mistbands. And in Grendel, Gongen, and Goddess, right? And Heaney had God cursed Grendel came greedily loping. So 3 G's in the second line. Here's the caesura, this space in the middle. That's the caesura, the gap, the break in the line. And usually how the alliteration works is you'll have 1 or 2 words from the first half line that alliterates with a word in the second half line. That's a simplified version of it, but that's basically the poetic style, the poetic craft of Old English poetry. Alliterative half lines, they're sometimes called, right? Half a line here alliterates with the other half of the line here. Mor misleothum Grendel gongen goddess. All right. And, Heaney, our translator, great poet, obviously one of the, you might have heard of him, I don't know. He's one of the most celebrated poets of the 20th century, the later 20th century, does a really nice job capturing the essence of that alliterative style. When you read the translation, it's one of the reasons why I really like this translation, even if it's not always the most literally accurate, which is probably less important than capturing the vibe. All right, so just a couple of other things to note about the style of the poetry, right? Okay, uh, the shop is the bard or storyteller. He would have been the guy who went around to traveled around and told this story before it was written down around the fire or whatever. So it was an oral composition, an oral transmission until the time it was written down in manuscript form at some point around the year 1000, right? And they're just like with Gilgamesh and the Iliad, there are aspects of the style that are characteristic of oral formulaic poetry that has been preserved in the written text. We mentioned mnemonic devices when we talked about Gilgamesh. All the repetition, right, in Gilgamesh was evidence of oral formulaic lines, and in the Iliad, right, there were naming conventions that spoke to its oral formulaic nature. The fact that Hector was always referred to by the same epithet, horse-breaking Hector, and godlike Achilles, right? These naming conventions, these sort of nicknames or whatever, not nicknames, but they're called epithets, right? They're descriptive forms of address that repeat over and over throughout the text. In Beowulf, you get that same kind of oral formulaic repetition. One example I can show you is there is a constant repetition of a particular style of I would call them kinds of signal phrases. One formula that repeats a lot throughout the poem is the Mathaloda formula, and it's right here. Here's an example. Haney translated it. Beowulf Echgaus Thun replied. Here it is in the Old English. Beowulf Mathaloda Bear Nechthauus, which means Beowulf spoke, the son of Echthau. And you'll see that the poet uses this formula a lot. So-and-so spoke, the son of so-and-so. That patronymic here, the son of Echthau, and it's usually with Beowulf Mathaloda Bear Nechthau, or Beowulf Mathaloda Sunu Echthau. Sometimes with Hrothgar, Hrothgar Mathaloda Bear Na Halfdane. It's a formula that perfectly fits an alliterative half line, and it's really easy for the bard or the shop to sort of plug it in and remember, and use it as a transition point. There are also epithets in Beowulf as well, like the helm of the shieldings, right? The things like that are used formulaically throughout the text. So it's clearly, again, we're in the world of oral formulaic poetry. Okay, so that's let me stop now with the language and the technical aspects. I could talk about them all day, obviously, but what is this poem all about? The things I'm interested in already, and so again, we have an epic, right? There are elements, at least, of epic writing here. The length, the mythic qualities, right? Those we've seen again and again. The stuff about the divine intervention, obviously, divinity and gods are much different in Beowulf than they are in the other texts we've read, because at least on the surface, right, Beowulf seems to exist. It is post-Christian, right? The writer of the manuscript, at least, was clearly some kind of monotheistic Christian. St. Augustine had arrived in England to convert everybody. I think, what was it, in the 5th century, Augustine's mission. So, by the time Beowulf was written, Christianity was pretty well established among these Germanic peoples, and probably goes back even further among the Celtic peoples of Britain. So there is no pantheon. I mean, we are dealing with Scandinavians here, right? Beowulf is from Geatland. Hrothgar is from Denmark, right? Most of the action takes place in Denmark. These are Scandinavian locales. We're not in England. But let's see, where was I? Um, let's go back. Even though it takes place in Scandinavia, right? We don't have. Where's the thing on the bit about theisms? Yeah. All right. Okay. Okay. We don't have. There's no Thor and Odin and Frigga and Loki, and there's no pantheon of Norse gods here meddling around in the affairs of humans. We're in a kind of monotheistic, quasi-monotheistic, at least, world. At least, even if the poet often makes reference to the fact that the characters themselves are sort of pagans, but that they're wrong to think this way. Where are my controls here? Ooh. What's going on? And so I'm really sorry, everybody. I can't find every once in a while the controls just vanish for the screen recorder. What's going on here? Okay, sorry. So instead, so let me give you an example. Grendel attacks Heorot, which is Hrothgar's great mead hall, and if you want to get a sense of what we're talking about here, what a mead hall is, all you have to do is watch the Lord of the Rings Part 2, The Two Towers, and because the mead hall of Meduseld, where Theoden lives, is modeled off of Heorot. Tolkien was a great Anglo-Saxonist, one of the greatest that ever lived. And so it's this big, huge structure where everybody would gather together to drink mead and celebrate and have a good time, and the king would conduct sort of his affairs of state. Particularly, he would engage in gift giving with his thanes, right? And they would pledge loyalty to him, and there would be a lot of cementing of the bonds of loyalty at these celebrations at the mead hall, as we see in the text of the story. But when Grendel attacks Heorot and starts killing people, and nobody can stop him, there's this sense of hopelessness. All right, so let's start here with Grendel's attack, right? Okay. Let's take it from line 99. All right, there's line 99. All right, get the line 99 in your book. So this is Grendel's attack on Heorot, and a couple of things are going to come up here. One, we're talking about the sense of the divine here, and it's something that we've all written about already. So it's interesting to compare how the divine functions in Beowulf compared to how it functions in, say, the Iliad or Gilgamesh. It's much more subtle. But we can also have an opportunity to talk about Grendel and the themes that underlie the sort of war between Grendel and Heorot, right? So times were pleasant for the people there until finally one, a fiend out of hell, began to work his evil in the world. Now there's that word hell. In the original Old English, they're found on hell. So this isn't Haney taking liberties. It's right there in the Old English. Found on hell, or the fiend out of hell. Obviously, clearly a reference to a Christian theology, right? That's where hell. There is no hell anywhere else. Well, that's not true. I mean, there are versions of hells in other cultures, and we saw Aeneas going down to the underworld and things like that. But hell, that word hell, is very much of a evocative of Christian eschatology. A fiend out of hell began to work his evil in the world. Grendel was the name of this grim demon, haunting the marches, marauding round the heath and the desolate fens. He had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters, Cain's clan, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts. For the killing of Abel, the Eternal Lord had exacted a price. Cain got no good from committing that murder because the Almighty made him anathema, and out of the curse of his exile there sprang ogres and elves and evil phantoms, and the giants too strove with God time and again until he gave them their reward. All right, here's our introduction to Grendel, and it is rife with biblical allusions, and particularly this idea that Grendel is a descendant of Cain, right? And we read about Cain and Abel in Genesis, and we understand what the reference is here to the guy who committed the first murder, and the fact that Cain was sort of exiled and banished, and given the mark of Cain or whatever. In Genesis, the purpose of the story of Cain and Abel is to show the fallen state of man, right, in the post-Edenic landscape. And it's interesting to have Grendel, think of Grendel as being part of like a lineage and having a family, because in this poem, of course, family and lineage are so important. The very first thing we get in the poem is the lineage of Hrothgar, who his ancestors were, Shield Chafing, his great ancestor, who was this great king of the Shieldings or whatever, and his great funeral and all that, and all the way down till we get to Hrothgar's and his father Halfdane, etc. So we know the poet establishes his lineage, and every time Beowulf speaks, we know he's Beowulf, Madaloda Bear Echdau. He's the son of Echdau, right? Blood and lineage are very important things in this culture, as they were in many pre-modern cultures. Well, Grendel also has a lineage, and it goes back to Cain, right? And that tells us something about his essential nature, right? He is a demon out of hell who's descended from the first murderer. And his family, his clan, are all these other monsters that descended from Cain. These are his cousins, right? Ogres and elves and evil phantoms, and the giants too strove with God. And by elves, this is a reminder that elves in their origin, as mythic origins, are not like either cute little helpers in Santa's workshop or the sort of noble warriors of Lord of the Rings. They were more like gremlins or something, right? Things you're to be afraid of. In the original text, Eotanes and Elfa and Orkneas, swilche gigantes, swa with God awunan, lang athraya. So, Ettins, those are like, that's the ogres, right? And Ilf, the elves, and Orkneas, orcs, basically. In the original Old English, it's orcs. Haney translates it as evil phantoms, but I think in a post Lord of the Rings world, we could, or a post World of Warcraft world that we live in, I would have translated it as orcs. Ogres and elves and orcs, and the giants who strove with God. That's Grendel's clan. So he belongs to a kind of family as well, although they're all isolate, right? They don't like really keep each other company. They seem to have, they live very, very lonely, solitary existences, right? And so Grendel After nightfall, Grendel set out for the lofty house to see how the Ringdanes were settling into it after their drink, and there he came upon them, a company of the best, asleep from their feasting, insensible to pain and human sorrow. Suddenly, the god-cursed brute was creating havoc, greedy and grim. He grabbed 30 men. There's the alliteration, right? From their resting places and rushed to his lair, flushed up and inflamed from the raid, blundering back with the butchered corpses. Then, as dawn brightened and the day broke, Grendel's powers of destruction were plain. Their wassail was over. They wept to heaven and mourned under mourning. Their mighty prince, the storied leader, sat stricken and helpless, humiliated by the loss of his guard, bewildered and stunned. This is Hrothgar, right? Staring aghast at the demon's trail in deep distress. Um, and so the image is one of something similar to what we've talked about already, right? That you have two worlds, right? Um, the world of the community of quote unquote civilization, right? The mead hall, where people gather together for companionship, comfort, for statecraft, right? Where they eat and they drink, where they're warm and comfortable, right? And then you've got the world outside, the world of the moors and the fens and the wilderness. And as I said way back when we talked about Gilgamesh, and we talked about Gilgamesh traveling out of Uruk into the Forest of Cedars, right? That in pre-modern times, wilderness is a very scary place. And the enclaves of civilization are small and surrounded by much more dangerous places. And in some ways, um, in some ways, uh, we see a repetition of this theme that we've been talking about of civilization and wilderness, right? In this case, it's less about uh, the civilizing process like it is in Gilgamesh, and more about the threat that anything that isn't part of the commune, isn't part of the culture, isn't part of the enclosure of civilization represents to everyone and everything within it. And even in motive, right? Let's go up a little bit. Go up a little. Um, yeah. Back to line 86. We first introduced Grendel, and we hear about his motives. Then a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp being struck, and the clear song of a skilled poet. It torments Grendel to hear the sounds of merrymaking and joy and music and poetry and eating and drinking from Haleroad, right? So there's Grendel alone in the moors, right? This descendant of Cain, this clansman of ogres and orcs and all other kinds of foul monsters. And he can hear the singing and the merrymaking from Haleroad, and it torments him, right? It drives him mad. It drives him to commit these acts of violence against the mead hall. And so it's the process of community itself that is like the thing that pushes Grendel over the edge. So he, in a sense, represents, again, like those externalities, right? The things that exist beyond the scope of these narrow enclaves of civilization that pose a threat to it. And it's it's almost enough to make you sympathetic to Grendel. And there have been adaptations and representations of Beowulf in other media that have taken a more sympathetic look at Grendel. Although at the end of the day, it's hard to justify just butchering 30 men just because you're upset that you're not invited to the party or whatever. Um, okay, so but then yeah, what I was ultimately getting to here, with respect to the nature of the divine, is that there's this tension again between the Christian poet and the pagan setting. Uh, so Grendel waged his. This is line 164. So Grendel waged his lonely war, inflicting constant cruelties on the people, atrocious hurt. He took over Heorot, haunted the glittering hall after dark. With the throne itself, the treasure seat, he was kept from approaching. He was the Lord's outcast. These were hard times, heartbreaking for the Prince of the Shieldings. Powerful counselors, the highest in the land, would lend advice, plotting how best the bold defenders might resist and beat off sudden attacks. Sometimes at pagan shrines, they vowed offerings to idols, swore oaths that the killer of souls might come to their aid and save the people. So, in their desperation, they start praying to their pagan gods. And, there's no gods named, but of course, if they're Scandinavians, it could be they're praying to Odin or Thor or whoever, just as pagan shrines. But that kind of is interpreted by the poet as devil worship, right? Swore oaths that the killer of souls, that's the devil, might come to their aid and save the people. So in worshiping these pagan gods, they're actually worshiping the devil. Again, this is the Christian moralizing voice of the poet that's coming through. That was their way, their heathenish hope. Deep in their hearts, they remembered hell. The almighty judge of good deeds and bad, the Lord God, head of the heavens and high king of the world, look at all the epithets for God, was unknown to them. Oh, cursed is he who in times of trouble has to thrust his soul into the fire's embrace, forfeiting help. He has nowhere to turn, but blessed is he who after death can approach the Lord and find friendship in the Father's embrace. Almost a little like, so we get a little bit of like proselytizing here, right in the middle of this episode. And some people even speculated that, stuff like this was added later. It wasn't originally part of the fabric of the poem. That some Christian monk who was copying it decided to insert some preachy stuff. Whatever the case may be, there is this. We are in a point where we moved away from the gods, the pantheon of pagan gods, directly interjecting themselves into the affairs of men, and that is looked at by the poet as being a kind of primitive way of thinking. So interesting to compare, certainly to the Iliad, certainly to Gilgamesh. Very much a poem that is kind of straddling two worlds when it comes to the nature of the divine. And it's not consistent at all, right? Beowulf clearly believes in God, makes references to the Almighty, even though he's a man of that time. He's somehow anachronistically very much a monotheist, right? Believes and there's no logical sense to it, but we don't have to make logical sense out of it because it's an 8th century epic. So let's just let it be what it is. All right. So one of the things that I mentioned in the the burials, right? Aside from the pagan worship, right? There's all these Viking funerals that we get, like the funeral of Shield Chafing and Beowulf's pyre, right? There are no Christian burials in this story. We've got people floated out on boats, like you would imagine, right? Like Boromir in Fellowship of the Ring. We've got people on giant pyres, just like Beowulf's funeral is a lot like Hector's, right? They pile him in a pyre with all this stuff and they set it on fire. So that's the pagan aspects of this culture. At the same time that the poet himself is very much a Christian. All right. Going back to the background. Yeah. Okay. So how are we doing on time here? Not great. So we've got this, clearly there's this hierarchical social system at work in the story. The idea of kingship itself is very important. You've got the king who's surrounded by a retinue of loyal warriors, and the king gives treasure to them as a way of cementing their bonds of loyalty. The word for the sort of social system at work here is comitatus. And very briefly, comitatus refers to the system by which a king earns the loyalty of his thanes, and they in turn pledge loyalty to him. And it's all marked by this dispensing of treasure and giving of gifts. There are multiple scenes in Beowulf where a king in a mead hall gives out gifts to his loyal subjects. Hrothgar does it in Heorot, right? Hrothgar also does it for Beowulf, right? Gives him horses, and Unferth gives him Hrunting, the sword, the heirloom sword, right? It's another thing that is important to the poem. And the idea is that loyalty is not just for the thanes to the king, but the king owes things to the people that follow him, right? And when it comes to Grendel, right, there is a kind of breakdown of that system because Hrothgar cannot keep the land safe. He cannot keep the mead hall safe, right? He kind of fails in his responsibilities as a king to make sure that that the seat of power, right, is defended, and his helplessness, right, is the vacuum which provides an opportunity for Beowulf to come in and do what Hrothgar can, which is protect the people from Grendel. And so Beowulf hears about it. When he heard about Grendel, Higelac's Thane was on the home ground over in Geatland. There was no one else like him alive in his day. He was the mightiest man on earth, highborn and powerful. Sounding a lot like Gilgamesh, right? And so it's like, I'm going to make my name, I'm going to make myself famous by killing Grendel. And almost kind of like Gilgamesh, right? In the sense that Beowulf is not just one thing, right? We see Gilgamesh as a king and as a hero. First, we meet him as a king, and then we meet him as a monster killer when he fights Humbaba. And Beowulf is kind of reversed. Beowulf makes his name as a monster killer, and then later in the poem becomes a king. Both aspects of their personalities are important. Beowulf, but they are both very interested in this idea of fame, that their names can be preserved, that they will sort of burnish their reputation by doing great deeds. Around line 425, Beowulf sort of gives a sense of his motive, partly what motivates him, right? Now he's talking to Hrothgar here. He's arrived in Denmark, and he's announced his intentions to kill Grendel for Hrothgar. Now I mean to be a match for Grendel, settle the outcome in single combat. Remember, he's showed up here with like an army, like a retinue of men, but he wants to fight Grendel alone. Why would he want to fight Grendel alone? Because it's a question of honor and the greatness of the deed, right? And so my request, O King of Bright Danes, dear Prince of the Shieldings, friend of the people and their ring of defense, my one request is that you won't refuse me, who have come this far, the privilege of purifying Heorot with my own men to help me and nobody else. And not even them. They're going to help him set up the plan, but they're not actually going to fight Grendel. I have heard, moreover, that the monster scorns in his reckless way to use weapons. Therefore, to heighten Higelac's fame, that's Beowulf's king, To heighten Higelac fame and gladden his heart, I hereby renounce sword and the shelter of the broad shield, the heavy warboard. Hand to hand is how it will be, a life and death fight with the fiend. Whichever one death fells must deem it a just judgment by God. Almost like a kind of trial by combat, right? And here's, again, Beowulf invoking God and God's uh, power to dictate the outcome of things. Even though, again, like Beowulf's a man of his time, and the poet said to us that back then they didn't know God. It's, again, not consistent. If Grendel wins, it will be a gruesome day. He will glut himself on the Geats in the war hall, swoop without fear on that flower of manhood as on others before. Then my face won't be there to be covered in death. He will carry me away as he goes to ground, gorged and bloodied. He will run gloating with my raw corpse and feed on it alone in a cruel frenzy, fouling his moor nest. No need then to lament for long or lay out my body. If the battle takes me, send me back, etc. Fate send me back this breast webbing that Wayland fashioned and Trethel gave me to Lord Higelac. Send back my armor to my king. Fate goes ever as fate must. Fate goes ever as fate must. Which gaeth a weird swahe shell. Weird destiny goes as it shall. Fate goes ever as fate must. So a lot going on here. Beowulf invoking God on the one hand, but on the other hand, invoking this idea of fate, of weird. And right, going back to theism, weird is the pagan idea of arbitrary fate, right? This idea that there's not necessarily a plan, but there's not, what happens is not necessarily based on who is good and who is bad, but on the sort of whims of a force we can't understand. This weird. So fate goes ever as fate must. Gaeth a weird swahe shall. But note here what Beowulf says. I'm going to fight alone. I don't want anybody's help. And since Grendel doesn't use weapons, I'm not going to use any weapons either. Because that just wouldn't be sporting. That wouldn't be fair. And what we're seeing here is that what Beowulf wants is to maximize the greatness of the deed by conducting it in the most heroic way possible. He's not just here thinking about, I'm going to save Hrothgar from Grendel and save the Danes from this scourge and do it the smartest way possible, right? He's thinking, I am here to do a great deed, in part for the purposes of burnishing my own fame and reputation and to be known far and wide, and therefore I'm not going to get any help and I'm not going to use any weapons. And if you remember, like when Gilgamesh goes to fight Humbaba, there is something similar at work. He wants to make a name for himself. Gilgamesh, who went into battle with fierce Humbaba, right? That name will be on their lips forever. So the acquisition of fame is still a motivating factor here for our heroes, and as it was also for Hector, right? Who didn't want to, who fought Achilles one-on-one precisely because he was afraid if he didn't that he would be shamed by it. So the more things change, the more they also stay the same. Heroes are still very cocksure, very full of themselves, and very concerned with their reputations far and wide. So, of course, Beowulf does fight him alone. It's a great wrestling match. And it ends with, one of the more famous finishing blows in literature. Where Beowulf rips Grendel's arm right out of its socket. You gotta skip. There's the big celebration at Hera before the battle. We are at line. Oh, I went too far, didn't I? Hang on, wait. All right, so this is line 808. So they have been wrestling and struggling, and then we learn that Grendel can't be harmed by any weapons. He has a sort of magic protection, so no sword can cut him. So the other Geats are sort of breaking their swords on Grendel and everything, as Beowulf and Grendel are sort of thrashing about. And finally, Beowulf defeats him just with pure brute strength. Then he who had harrowed the hearts of men, this is line 808, with pain and afflictions in former times, and had given offense also to God, found that his bodily powers failed him. Higelac's kinsman, that's Beowulf, kept him helplessly locked in a hand grip. As long as either lived, he was hateful to the other. The monster's whole body was in pain. A tremendous wound appeared on his shoulder. Sinews split and the bone lappings burst. Beowulf was granted the glory of winning. Grendel was driven under the fen banks, fatally hurt to his desolate lair. His days were numbered. The end of his life was coming over him. He knew it for certain, and one bloody clash had fulfilled the dearest wishes of the Danes. The man who had lately landed among them, proud and sure, had purged the hall, kept it from harm. He was happy with his night work and the courage he had shown. The great captain had boldly fulfilled his boast to the Danes. He had healed and relieved a huge distress, unremitting humiliations, the hard fate they'd been forced to undergo, no small affliction. Clear proof of this could be seen in the hand the hero displayed, high up near the roof, the whole of Grendel's shoulder and arm, his awesome grasp. So he's holding up the severed arm of Grendel that he's ripped right out of its socket. And that's the end of Grendel. All right, well, we're going to stop here. But we've gotten to talk at least about the language, about the poetics, about the historical context, and some of the important themes of the work. Of course, the killing of Grendel is not the end of things. Grendel's mother comes back for revenge. Beowulf has to fight her. And then he goes home to be king of Geatland and is a great and wonderful king, and everybody loves him. And then the dragon is woken up by the thief who steals his cup from the hoard. Again, a very much evocative of Tolkien. And Beowulf has to have his final battle with the dragon, which unfortunately we're not going to get to talk about in this lecture, but is definitely a great read. So sign off for now. Definitely check out the notes that I posted as well about Beowulf on the page. To fill out some of the additional thematic context and details, and we'll we'll move right along from here to our next work, which I'll be posting shortly. All right. Thank you very much.